All of these details are remembered from when I was a child receiving secondhand information, so please take all details with a grain of salt. Attached: when I was a child, my mother owned a campsite property in the jungles of Belize that traveling backpackers would frequent to visit the caves and jungles of the area. It was a beautiful, remote spot in a valley surrounded by only a small Mennonite community and some local villagers a few miles away. There weren't many roads, most of which were dirt, and it was hard to traverse through the thick, mountainous wilderness if you weren't taking the main road in and out of the valley. All of this is to say, it was extremely remote and hard to reach, so random strangers passing through was not the norm unless they were explicitly there to visit the campsite. There were around 6 other homes in the valley that were reachable by foot. 5 of them were inhabited by the peaceful local Mennonite community, but one was owned by an American woman who had a reputation for being a cruel, vitriolic problem starter. There was even a rumor that she lived in Belize because she was wanted by the FBI for bleep in America. There were also rumors that she hired local men to steal and vandalize others' properties for her. We'll call her Carrie. One example I remember of her behavior was an interaction I had with her when I was around 10. My brothers and I were friends with the property owner's kids, so we would all float down the creek in tubes and walk back up the road to the property. We all felt safe doing this, as there were usually at least 4 of us together at a time. Carrie would often run down to her fence line when she heard us coming and scream at us the entire time we walked past. No matter how quiet or loud we were being, she threatened to let her 3 large dogs out to attack us. And one time, she chased us down the street with a gun. That was the last time we were allowed to walk back up the street without an adult. One afternoon, a female friend and I were playing in the swimming area of the creek in front of the main building of my mother's property. We were around age 14 at the time. There was a huge rock that jutted up out of the water on the far side of the creek, and above that, the mountainside rose up at a sheer 90-degree angle. Bulging out in some areas, it formed a sort of rounded jungle cliff that was impossible to climb up or down from, making the swimming hole and main campsite building feel closed off and peaceful. As we stood on our side of the creek bank splashing into water, I looked up and caught a glimpse of movement atop the rocky cliff. There, crouched in some bushes with a black bandana tied around his face, was a man in dark clothing watching us play in the water. I still remember the feeling of ice-cold dread as my heart plunged into my stomach. He was holding a machete, and he had the most hateful look in his eyes that I have ever seen. In my young mind, I immediately knew he was up to something bad. It wouldn't have been easy to get to the spot he was now crouching in without being seen if he came from our side, so he likely had hiked from the other side of the hilltop. If that were the case, he must have been surprised to have found the cliff there with no way down. For several long moments, the man and I stared at each other until my friend grabbed my wrist. We sprinted together back up the stairs into the building where our parents were. My mother and her parents immediately came out yelling bloody bleep at the man, shouting at him to leave and never return or he would regret it. But by the time we actually got back to the creekside, the man was gone. Later that week, some of the adults managed to find a way to the spot he'd been seen and found a discarded water bottle, suggesting he'd been there for some time. From then on, we were extra careful where we went alone in Belize. Years later, after my mother had sold the property and we stopped visiting, we heard news from the area that someone had been found deceased in the orange grove on my mother's old property. The death was tied back to Carrie, but she was never arrested due to local police corruption, it all happening so remotely, and the fact that she hired someone and didn't do it herself. My mother is convinced to this day that Carrie had hired the man in the bushes. To what end, we don't know, but the way he was staring at me and my friend makes my brain go to dark places, and we wouldn't have been the only little girls to have gone missing in the valley. So Carrie, and any of your associates, let's not meet.